What IBRAHIM Traoré just said about Jesus left Donald Trump in tears. In the bustling heart of New York City, amidst the towering skyscrapers and the constant hum of activity, a significant event was unfolding. The United Nations headquarters, a symbol of global diplomacy, was hosting a high-profile international summit. Leaders from various nations had gathered to discuss pressing global issues, ranging from climate change to economic disparities. Among the attendees were two individuals whose paths had never crossed before, yet whose encounter would leave an indelible mark on the world stage. IBRAHIM Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, was a relatively new figure in international politics. At just 37 years old, he had risen to prominence after leading a military coup in 2022, overthrowing the then-President Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. Since then, he had positioned himself as a leader advocating for Pan-Africanism, economic independence, and a departure from Western influence. His policies resonated with many across Africa, earning him both admiration and criticism. BlackPast.org+1 The Washington Post+1 Donald Trump, on the other hand, was a seasoned political figure. Having served as the 45th President of the United States from 2017 to 2021, he had made a dramatic return to the political arena by winning the 2024 election, becoming the 47th president. Known for his unorthodox style and populist rhetoric, Trump had always been a polarizing figure. His policies often sparked debates, but his influence on the global stage was undeniable. The summit was a melting pot of diverse ideologies and perspectives. As the leaders took their seats in the Grand Assembly Hall, the air was thick with anticipation. Discussions commenced on various topics, with each leader presenting their nation's stance on the issues at hand. The debates were intense, yet respectful, reflecting the gravity of the matters being discussed. Amidst these discussions, a break was announced. Leaders and delegates mingled, exchanging pleasantries and engaging in side conversations. It was during this interlude that Traoré and Trump found themselves in close proximity. Their eyes met, and a silent acknowledgement passed between them. Despite their differing backgrounds and political ideologies, there was a shared understanding of the weight of their respective positions. Curiosity piqued, Trump approached Traoré. "Mr. President," he began, extending a hand, "it's an honor to meet you." Traoré smiled warmly, accepting the handshake. "The honor is mine," he replied. The two leaders engaged in a brief conversation, discussing the summit's agenda and the challenges facing their nations. Despite their differences, there was a mutual respect evident in their exchange. As the break concluded, the leaders returned to the Assembly Hall. However, the brief interaction between Traoré and Trump had left an impression on both. For Trump, it was the first time he had met a leader like Traoré, young, idealistic, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. For Traoré, it was a reminder of the complexities of global politics and the need for dialogue, even with those whose views differed sharply from his own. Little did they know that this chance encounter would set the stage for a moment that would captivate the world, a moment that would transcend politics and touch upon the very essence of humanity. But that story, as they say, is for another time. After the brief but memorable meeting during the summit break, IBRAHIM Traoré felt a quiet determination. He had come not just as a leader of a nation, but as a voice of conscience and faith. The weight of the world's problems was heavy on his shoulders, yet he believed that true change often started with words that carried meaning beyond politics. As he prepared to speak in the main hall again, he could feel the hum of expectation in the air. World leaders, diplomats, and journalists were all present, their eyes fixed on the stage, waiting to hear what insights might be shared at this pivotal moment. Traoré's gaze moved across the room. He saw leaders speaking with confidence, yet sometimes forgetting the human dimension of their decisions. Policies were debated, statistics were presented, and strategies were outlined. But in his heart, Traoré believed that the foundation of leadership should be compassion, empathy, and moral courage. He wanted to remind the world of principles that were timeless, values that transcended borders, and a message that could unite people beyond political differences. When it was his turn to speak, Traoré stepped forward with calm composure. He adjusted the microphone and took a moment to look at the audience, acknowledging the importance of the moment. Today, he began, we gather to discuss the future of our nations, our communities, and our planet. We talk about policies, about trade, about security. These are vital, but we must never forget the foundation upon which all meaningful decisions should be built, our humanity. The room became quiet. Traoré's voice was steady but carried an emotional depth that caught the attention of every listener. He began to share a story from his own life, a story that illustrated the power of faith and moral guidance. He spoke of his childhood, growing up in Burkina Faso, in a community where people faced daily struggles but also found strength in faith, kindness, and support for one another. He described moments of hardship when his family relied not on wealth or influence, but on love, patience, and the lessons of moral courage taught by religious values. He then spoke about Jesus, not in a sermonizing way, but as an example of wisdom, humility, and unconditional love. Jesus taught us to see beyond ourselves, Traoré said. To care for the weak, to forgive those who wrong us, to act with integrity even when no one is watching. Leadership without compassion is leadership without purpose. We must remember that our decisions affect real people, families, and communities. If we forget this, we risk losing the trust and hope of those we serve. Traoré paused, letting his words resonate. He looked briefly at Donald Trump, who was seated nearby. There was no confrontation, no political tension, only a human connection, an acknowledgement that the principles being shared could touch anyone, regardless of their position or past. Trump listened intently, his usual confident expression softening as the sincerity in Traoré's voice became evident. Continuing, Traoré spoke about forgiveness. He told the audience about moments when he had faced opposition and criticism, moments when others doubted his intentions or challenged his leadership. In those moments, he found strength not in retaliation but in understanding and forgiveness. He explained that true courage was not in asserting dominance, but in choosing peace, dialogue, and reconciliation even when it was difficult. The audience was captivated. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered quietly to their neighbors, clearly moved by the universal truths being expressed. Traoré's words were simple yet powerful, grounded in personal experience yet applicable to global leadership. He emphasized that faith was not a political tool, but a moral compass. It reminded leaders to prioritize the well-being of their people over personal ambition or pride. Traoré then shared a story about a small village in Burkina Faso that had faced severe flooding. Families had lost homes, crops, and livelihoods. Despite the challenges, the community came together, supporting one another through shared effort and compassion. Traoré explained how even in such dire circumstances, faith and moral principles guided people to act selflessly. If leaders can cultivate this spirit on a larger scale, he said, we can address crises not just with resources, but with humanity. He shifted to the theme of unity. In a world often divided by ideology, nationality, or wealth, Traoré emphasized that common values like empathy, justice, and honesty could bridge gaps. When we act with understanding, he said, we create bridges where there were walls. We foster cooperation instead of conflict. And we show the world that leadership can be about service, not self-interest. Traoré's tone became more personal as he addressed the former U.S. president directly, though still speaking to the entire assembly. We are different in age, experience, and culture, but the challenges we face are universal. Leaders everywhere must remember that influence is not just about power, it is about responsibility. How we guide our people, how we treat those who look up to us, will define the legacy we leave. He continued to explain that true leadership often required humility. He acknowledged his own mistakes and learning experiences, emphasizing that admitting errors and seeking wisdom were signs of strength, not weakness. He spoke of mentors, teachers, and community elders who had guided him, illustrating the importance of listening and learning from others regardless of one's position. Throughout his speech, Traoré's words maintained a balance between hope and realism. He did not pretend that the world's problems were simple or that leadership was easy. But he highlighted that compassion, forgiveness, and ethical integrity were not just ideals, they were practical tools for creating lasting positive change. As he concluded, Traoré left the audience with a message that transcended politics and culture. We are all entrusted with the lives and futures of people who look to us for guidance. Let us act with wisdom, with courage, and with love. Let us be leaders who inspire not just through policies, but through the example of our hearts. May our decisions reflect not just ambition, but conscience. The hall remained silent for a moment. Then, slowly, applause began to rise. It was not the formal, polite applause often heard in diplomatic meetings. It was a heartfelt response to the authenticity of the message. Delegates exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. Some wiped away tears. Trump, visibly moved, remained seated, his usual guarded demeanor replaced with a reflective expression. Traoré stepped back, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had not come to the summit seeking personal acclaim. He had come to remind the world of timeless principles of leadership guided by ethics, empathy, and faith. He knew that true change often started with small sparks, words that could inspire others to act with integrity. And as he looked across the room, he saw the potential for that spark to ignite. This moment, seemingly ordinary at first glance, carried extraordinary significance. It was a reminder that in a world often dominated by power struggles and political maneuvering, genuine sincerity could still touch hearts. Traoré had spoken from experience, from reflection, and from a deep sense of responsibility. His words were a bridge between cultures, between generations, and between differing perspectives. As he returned to his seat, other leaders approached him quietly, expressing admiration for his speech. Some asked questions about how Burkina Faso had managed certain challenges. Others simply offered words of encouragement, recognizing that the moral clarity in his message was rare on the international stage. For Traoré, these interactions were not about building alliances or gaining favor, they were opportunities to reinforce a shared commitment to values that mattered most. By the end of the session, the impact of Traoré's words was evident. Media personnel recorded every detail, journalists scribbled notes, and social media began to buzz with quotes and reflections from the speech. Conversations erupted about the role of ethics, faith, and compassion in leadership. What began as a routine summit discussion had transformed into a moment of reflection and inspiration for those present. Traoré remained composed, aware that the journey of leadership was ongoing. The seeds of change had been planted, but the work was far from complete. Yet he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that even a single speech could encourage others to act with thoughtfulness and integrity. He had reminded the world that leadership, at its core, was not about dominance or prestige, it was about serving others with wisdom, humility, and heart. And as the hall slowly emptied, the echoes of his message lingered in the minds of all who had listened. Leaders returned to their discussions with a renewed sense of purpose, journalists carried the story to the world, and for one brief moment, humanity's higher values had taken center stage, reminding everyone that empathy and faith could inspire even in the most complex arenas of power. After the summit session, the atmosphere in the private lounge area was markedly different from the formal discussions in the main hall. The room was quieter, filled with soft conversations and the occasional clinking of cups as aides and assistants discussed the next steps in the schedule. Yet, there was an unmistakable tension in the air, a sense that something important had just taken place, something that went beyond protocols and press releases. Donald Trump, usually confident and composed, sat in a corner with a contemplative expression. His eyes, normally sharp and calculating, seemed softened, reflecting a rare moment of introspection. Trump could not stop thinking about what IBRAHIM Traoré had said. The young president's words about compassion, humility, and faith had struck a chord within him. He had expected political speeches, calls for cooperation, and reminders of strategy, but Traoré had spoken of principles that transcended politics. He had spoken of leadership guided by morality, of decisions influenced by empathy, and of a responsibility to serve humanity above self-interest. These were ideas that resonated deeply with Trump, challenging him to reflect on his own leadership journey. Trump recalled moments from his past, both successes and failures. He remembered the pressure of making decisions that affected millions of Americans, the intense scrutiny of the media, and the weight of expectations from supporters and critics alike. He had often relied on intuition, experience, and strategic calculation. But Traoré's speech reminded him that there was another dimension to leadership, one that required emotional intelligence, moral clarity, and the courage to act with empathy, even when it was difficult. Feeling moved, Trump rose from his seat and walked toward Traoré, who was engaged in conversation with a few aides. As he approached, he noticed the warmth and humility in Traoré's demeanor, a stark contrast to the polished and sometimes guarded nature of many world leaders. Trump extended his hand, and Traoré responded with a firm, respectful grip. There was no pomp, no ceremony, only two leaders connecting over shared values and mutual respect. "I wanted to speak with you personally," Trump began, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "Your words earlier, they meant a lot to me. It's not often that I hear such honesty and sincerity from a fellow leader." Traoré smiled, acknowledging the sentiment. "I appreciate your openness," he replied. "Leadership is never easy. We all carry the weight of our decisions, but we can choose to let compassion guide us as much as strategy and ambition." The conversation deepened. Trump shared his reflections on the pressures of the presidency and the challenges of balancing personal beliefs with public duty. He admitted that there were moments when he had acted out of necessity, sometimes forgetting the human impact of his decisions. Traoré listened attentively, offering gentle encouragement and insights drawn from his own experiences. He spoke of the importance of humility, of acknowledging mistakes, and of seeking guidance from ethical principles and faith. As they spoke, the room seemed to fade into the background. Other leaders and aides gave them space, recognizing that this exchange was personal, significant, and deeply human. Trump's usual guarded demeanor softened further, and he began to speak about his own spiritual journey. He described moments when he had sought meaning beyond politics, times when he had reflected on the values of family, faith, and integrity. He spoke of the influence of mentors, books, and life experiences that had shaped his understanding of leadership and responsibility. Traoré listened without interruption, nodding in acknowledgement. He did not offer judgment or criticism, only a presence that encouraged honesty and introspection. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted from formal politeness to genuine connection. They were not merely political figures discussing policy, they were human beings engaging in a profound dialogue about purpose, values, and the role of conscience in leadership. Trump paused, his eyes glistening slightly. It was a rare display of vulnerability, one that few had witnessed in public or private. He admitted that hearing Traoré speak of Jesus' teachings about love, forgiveness, and unity had touched something deep within him. It reminded him of lessons from his childhood, memories of family gatherings, and moments of faith that had shaped his moral compass long before entering politics. Traoré spoke next, gently emphasizing that such moments of reflection were vital for leaders. He explained that true influence was not measured by wealth, power, or public acclaim, but by the ability to inspire others to act ethically and with compassion. Leadership, he said, was a form of service, a commitment to guiding people toward a better, more just, and more caring world. Trump listened intently, absorbing the message. He recognized that leadership could be lonely, and that public figures often faced criticism regardless of their intentions. Yet, Traoré's words offered a framework for finding meaning and purpose in those moments, a reminder that empathy and moral courage could provide clarity in times of uncertainty. The conversation then turned to practical applications of these principles. Traoré shared examples from Burkina Faso, recounting initiatives that had prioritized community well-being, education, and reconciliation. He described how small acts of kindness and ethical decision-making had ripple effects, fostering trust, stability, and collaboration within communities. Trump reflected on similar efforts in the United States, acknowledging that while resources and policies were important, the human element often determined the success of any initiative. As the discussion continued, both leaders became aware of the symbolic power of their exchange. Cameras and journalists were not present in the private lounge, yet they knew that the impact of this conversation would extend far beyond the room. Their openness, sincerity, and willingness to connect on a human level could inspire others to prioritize empathy, integrity, and moral courage in leadership. At one point, Trump paused, placing a hand over his heart. "I never expected to be moved like this during a summit," he admitted quietly. "Your words, they remind me that no matter how high we rise, we must never forget the people we serve and the values that guide us." Traoré responded with warmth. "It is never too late to lead with conscience and compassion," he said. "We all have the capacity to make choices that uplift others, to create moments that matter, and to leave a positive legacy." Time seemed to stretch as their conversation continued, yet the summit schedule awaited. Eventually, aides signaled that it was time to return to formal proceedings. Both leaders exchanged a firm handshake, this time with a deeper understanding and connection than when they had first met. There was mutual respect, recognition of shared human values, and an unspoken acknowledgement that this moment would remain with them long after the summit concluded. As they parted ways in the lounge, Trump's mind was filled with reflection. He thought about the challenges he had faced, the decisions he had made, and the lessons he had learned. Traoré's words lingered, reminding him that leadership was not solely about authority or achievement, but about responsibility, empathy, and integrity. He realized that true strength was often found in humility, in the courage to act ethically, and in the ability to forgive and inspire. Outside the lounge, the world carried on unaware of the profound private exchange that had just taken place. Yet for Trump and Traoré, the impact was immediate and lasting. They had shared a moment that transcended politics, a connection rooted in shared humanity and the pursuit of moral clarity. It was a moment that would influence their perspectives, decisions, and the way they approached leadership in the days to come. The media would later capture glimpses of the event, reporting on the summit and highlighting key speeches. Yet the true essence of the exchange, the sincerity, the vulnerability, and the heartfelt reflections remained largely unseen by the public. Those who witnessed it firsthand knew that a rare and meaningful dialogue had occurred, one that exemplified the potential for leaders to connect across differences and inspire one another through integrity and compassion. In the quiet moments following the conversation, Trump sat alone for a few minutes, reflecting on what had transpired. He thought about the power of words, the impact of moral guidance, and the importance of maintaining humility and empathy in leadership. Traoré, meanwhile, returned to his delegation, carrying a sense of purpose and hope. He knew that even brief encounters could spark reflection and change, and that meaningful dialogue was one of the most powerful tools for building bridges between individuals and nations. By the end of the day, both leaders felt a renewed sense of responsibility. Traoré continued to advocate for ethical leadership and compassion, while Trump carried the weight of inspiration, realizing that moments like this could redefine how he approached decisions and interactions with others. Though the summit was filled with protocols, speeches, and formalities, it was the private, sincere exchange that would leave a lasting imprint on both of their journeys. As night fell over New York City, the summit hall emptied, lights dimmed, and the city's skyline glowed against the darkness. Yet in that quiet aftermath, a profound connection had been forged, a connection that spoke of empathy, moral courage, and the enduring power of faith and values. It was a reminder that even in the highest corridors of power, human hearts could meet, reflect, and inspire change in ways that transcend politics, influence, and status. After the summit, News of the private conversation between Ibrahim Traoré and Donald Trump began to spread quickly, though initially in whispers among aides and diplomats. What had taken place in the lounge was not an official statement or a planned press moment, it was a genuine, heartfelt exchange that few had witnessed. Yet the significance of it could not be ignored. People began talking about the moment, sharing it in small circles, and speculating on how it might influence the leaders' approaches and the broader political landscape. By the next morning, the story reached journalists, commentators, and media outlets around the world. International newsrooms picked up fragments of the conversation, focusing on the emotional depth and the human connection between two leaders from vastly different backgrounds. Social media platforms quickly amplified the narrative, with posts highlighting Traoré's message of compassion, forgiveness, and faith. Hashtags like #faith in leadership, #Traoré Trump moment, and #human connection began trending, capturing the attention of millions globally. People from all walks of life reacted to the story. Citizens, activists, religious groups, and students shared reflections on how leadership could be redefined through empathy and moral integrity. Many expressed admiration for Traoré's courage in speaking openly about his beliefs and values, emphasizing that such sincerity was rare in international politics. Others were equally intrigued by Trump's reaction, noting how the former president's emotional response demonstrated vulnerability, honesty, and the capacity for introspection even amidst years of public scrutiny. Religious leaders also commented on the significance of the exchange. They highlighted the way Traoré had referenced Jesus' teachings, emphasizing love, forgiveness, and service to others as a reminder that faith could provide guidance not only to individuals but also to those in positions of power. Some pointed out that when leaders allow moral and spiritual principles to inform their decisions, the impact on society can be profound, fostering unity, compassion, and trust. Political analysts debated the long-term implications. Some suggested that the moment could serve as a turning point in how international leaders approach diplomacy and policy making. By prioritizing values and human connection, leaders might develop a more cooperative, understanding, and ethically guided approach to global challenges. Others were skeptical, noting that while the moment was inspiring, it remained to be seen whether it would translate into concrete actions and policy changes. Despite differing opinions, one consensus emerged: the human element in leadership had been powerfully highlighted. Traoré's words and Trump's reaction reminded the world that decisions, treaties, and negotiations are ultimately about people, their lives, their hopes, and their futures. The story resonated not because of political strategy or ideology, but because it reflected a universal truth, that empathy, humility, and moral courage are essential components of effective leadership. Media coverage expanded beyond traditional news outlets. Television programs aired segments analyzing the speech and the conversation, emphasizing how rare it was to witness such authenticity among global leaders. Interviews with diplomats, experts, and scholars explored the ethical dimensions of leadership, reflecting on how values, faith, and empathy could shape international relations. Social media influencers, bloggers, and content creators joined the conversation, creating videos, posts, and discussions that reached millions. The moment had become a global phenomenon, sparking reflection across cultures and continents. At the same time, ordinary citizens engaged with the story in their own ways. In classrooms, teachers used the example of Traoré and Trump to discuss the importance of ethical decision-making and empathy. Students debated how leaders could balance power and responsibility while remaining grounded in moral principles. Communities organized discussions about leadership, integrity, and the impact of individual actions on society. The story had become more than news, it had evolved into a catalyst for learning, reflection, and dialogue. Religious organizations also took note, emphasizing the role of faith in guiding ethical behavior. Sermons, articles, and social media posts highlighted how Traoré's references to Jesus' teachings offered practical lessons for leaders and citizens alike. Faith communities praised the exchange for demonstrating that moral principles and compassion could transcend political differences, offering a pathway to understanding, reconciliation, and cooperation. Meanwhile, politicians and diplomats observed the moment with curiosity and interest. Some leaders reached out to express admiration for Traoré's approach, seeking guidance on how to incorporate empathy and moral consideration into their own work. Others saw an opportunity to engage in dialogue that emphasized shared values and mutual respect. The ripple effect of the conversation extended far beyond the lounge, influencing discussions in offices, committee meetings, and international forums. The conversation also sparked personal reflection among leaders and officials. Many considered their own experiences and decisions, evaluating whether they had acted with sufficient empathy, fairness, and integrity. The story served as a reminder that leadership is not solely about authority or policy, it is also about example, inspiration, and the moral impact of one's actions. It encouraged leaders to prioritize human dignity, understanding, and ethical conduct in every decision they made. In addition, the global public embraced the story as a symbol of hope. People were inspired by the idea that even the most powerful figures could pause, reflect, and demonstrate compassion. The narrative encouraged individuals to practice empathy in their own lives, to forgive, to seek understanding, and to act with integrity. The moment became a metaphor for leadership in everyday life, demonstrating that moral courage and kindness could create meaningful change at any level. Educational institutions also engaged with the story. Schools and universities introduced discussions about leadership, ethics, and faith, using the Traoré-Trump exchange as a case study. Students were encouraged to think critically about how leaders balance power and responsibility, and how moral principles can guide decisions in complex situations. The story became a learning tool, inspiring a new generation to consider the importance of empathy, honesty, and integrity in both leadership and personal conduct. The arts and media responded creatively as well. Writers, filmmakers, and artists explored the themes of the exchange, crafting works that highlighted the power of human connection, moral courage, and ethical leadership. Poetry, essays, and visual art celebrated the idea that leadership grounded in values could inspire hope, unity, and progress. The conversation between Traoré and Trump became a source of creative inspiration, influencing cultural expression around the world. Within Burkina Faso, citizens celebrated their president's courage and sincerity. People expressed pride that their leader had shared his values openly on the international stage, demonstrating a commitment to ethical leadership and global understanding. Discussions emerged about how moral principles could inform national policies, community projects, and social initiatives. The story fostered a sense of collective pride, reinforcing the belief that principled leadership could have both national and international impact. In the United States, many were struck by Trump's visible emotional response. Supporters and critics alike noted the humanity displayed in the private moment, highlighting the rare instance of vulnerability and introspection. Analysts and commentators discussed how the encounter reflected the importance of emotional intelligence in leadership, emphasizing that strength and compassion could coexist. The narrative became a reminder that even powerful figures are human, capable of reflection, growth, and empathy. As days passed, the story continued to gain momentum. International forums, conferences, and discussions referenced the moment, using it to illustrate the significance of values-driven leadership. Policy advisors and diplomats considered how empathy, moral guidance, and ethical reflection could be integrated into negotiations, treaties, and programs. The private conversation, once unnoticed by the public, had become a touchstone for broader conversations about leadership, ethics, and global cooperation. The impact was not limited to politics. Social movements and community organizations cited the story as an example of how ethical reflection and empathy could inspire meaningful action. People were encouraged to engage in acts of kindness, forgiveness, and understanding, recognizing that even small gestures could create significant change. The story served as a reminder that values and principles are not abstract ideas, they are practical tools for building stronger communities and more compassionate societies. By the end of the week, the Traoré-Trump moment had firmly established itself in public consciousness. It was discussed in media outlets, academic circles, religious communities, and public forums. People continued to reflect on the lessons of empathy, humility, and moral courage, applying them to leadership, personal decisions, and community engagement. The story had transcended its initial context, becoming a symbol of hope, inspiration, and the enduring power of human connection. Even as the summit concluded and leaders returned to their countries, the ripple effects persisted. Conversations about moral leadership, ethical decision-making, and empathy continued to shape discussions among policymakers, citizens, and organizations worldwide. Traoré and Trump had created a moment that reminded the world of the profound impact of values, compassion, and sincerity, an impact that would continue to influence thought, dialogue, and action for years to come. In every corner of the globe, from classrooms to government offices, from social media feeds to community gatherings, people reflected on the significance of that private conversation. It was more than a story, it was a lesson, an inspiration, and a call to action. Leaders and ordinary citizens alike were reminded that empathy, moral courage, and ethical reflection are not just ideals, they are essential tools for creating a more just, compassionate, and unified world. The moment had started in a quiet lounge during a high-profile summit, but its effects had become universal. It highlighted that even brief, sincere interactions between leaders could spark reflection, inspire action, and touch hearts across nations. Traoré's message and Trump's reaction had shown that leadership grounded in values could resonate far beyond politics, shaping not only policy but also the hearts and minds of people everywhere. A year had passed since the summit in New York City, and the world had not forgotten the moment when IBRAHIM Traoré spoke from the heart about compassion, faith, and leadership, and when Donald Trump responded with visible emotion. That brief, sincere exchange had left an impression far greater than anyone could have predicted. It had sparked discussions in classrooms, boardrooms, media outlets, and homes worldwide. People continued to reflect on the significance of leadership guided by values, and how a single moment could inspire hope and change across borders. Traoré, in the year following the summit, continued to focus on the principles he had spoken about. He implemented initiatives in Burkina Faso that emphasized education, community well-being, and ethical governance. Schools and community centers were strengthened to teach not only academics but also moral values, empathy, and service. Children and young adults were encouraged to understand the importance of helping others, making ethical choices, and practicing forgiveness and kindness in their daily lives. Communities across Burkina Faso began to reflect the values Traoré had emphasized. Neighborhoods organized programs to help the elderly and vulnerable, volunteers provided assistance to those in need, and families were encouraged to teach younger generations the importance of empathy and moral responsibility. Leaders at local levels were inspired to make decisions that prioritized human welfare, demonstrating that the principles of ethical leadership could be applied in everyday life. Meanwhile, in the United States, Trump's response to Traoré's message continued to influence his approach to leadership. He began emphasizing the importance of empathy, moral reflection, and listening to people from all walks of life. Policies and initiatives were increasingly shaped not only by strategy and politics but also by consideration for human impact and ethical responsibility. Advisors noticed a shift in tone and approach, as conversations included more emphasis on fairness, understanding, and compassionate action. Internationally, the story of the exchange became a reference point for leaders and organizations seeking to foster ethical leadership. Conferences and workshops were organized to teach the lessons of the Traoré-Trump moment. Leaders from different countries shared experiences of implementing policies guided by values and empathy. The conversation inspired diplomats to consider not just the political or economic consequences of their decisions, but also the moral and human dimensions. Media outlets continued to highlight the long-term influence of the event. Documentaries, articles, and news segments explored how leadership grounded in values could impact global cooperation, social stability, and community development. Journalists interviewed people whose lives had been touched by initiatives inspired by Traoré's emphasis on empathy and service. The narrative reinforced the idea that leadership is not simply about power, it is about responsibility, conscience, and the ability to inspire others to act with integrity. The global reaction was not limited to politicians or media. Ordinary citizens took inspiration from the story, applying its lessons to their own lives. People began to focus more on acts of kindness, forgiveness, and service within their families, neighborhoods, and workplaces. Social media posts highlighted everyday examples of empathy and moral courage, showing how values could be lived out in practical ways. Communities began to collaborate on projects to improve the lives of those around them, emphasizing shared responsibility and collective action. Faith communities also embraced the story as a reminder of the power of values in guiding behavior. Religious leaders encouraged followers to consider how principles of compassion, humility, and service could influence their actions. The example set by Traoré and Trump was used to show that faith and moral reflection could inform leadership, decision-making, and personal conduct, creating a ripple effect that extended beyond politics into every area of society. Educational programs inspired by the exchange grew in number and reach. Schools incorporated lessons on ethical leadership, empathy, and social responsibility into their curricula. Students engaged in projects that emphasized community service, moral reasoning, and problem-solving grounded in values. Teachers reported that students were increasingly motivated to think about the impact of their actions on others, demonstrating that the lessons of leadership and compassion could begin at an early age. A year later, a global peace summit was held, bringing together leaders from around the world. Traoré and Trump were both invited to speak, reflecting the lasting significance of their previous encounter. Traoré shared updates on initiatives in Burkina Faso, emphasizing how communities were embracing compassion, service, and ethical decision-making. He spoke about the importance of teaching these values to future generations, showing how small acts of empathy could lead to widespread positive change. Trump, in his speech, reflected on how the exchange had influenced his perspective. He spoke about the importance of humility, moral courage, and ethical reflection in leadership. He highlighted examples of initiatives and policies that prioritized human well-being, showing that lessons from one meaningful moment could inspire action on a much larger scale. Both leaders emphasized that leadership was ultimately about service, integrity, and the impact one had on others. The audience at the summit, made up of diplomats, students, activists, and global citizens, listened attentively. Many were moved by the sincerity and humility demonstrated by both leaders. The speeches became widely shared and discussed, continuing the conversation about values-driven leadership. Social media erupted with quotes, reflections, and discussions about how empathy, moral courage, and service could guide leaders and citizens alike. In the months following the summit, the momentum continued. International organizations launched initiatives to promote ethical leadership, conflict resolution, and community service. Governments considered policies that incorporated principles of fairness, compassion, and long-term social benefit. NGOs and educational institutions collaborated to create programs that taught ethical decision-making and empathy to young leaders, preparing the next generation to lead with conscience and care. Traoré and Trump were invited to various forums, conferences, and discussions around the world, sharing their experiences and reflections. Their story became a symbol of the power of dialogue, moral courage, and human connection. People admired that two leaders with different political and cultural backgrounds could connect in a meaningful way, emphasizing values and ethics over politics or ideology. Within communities, the exchange had inspired local initiatives. People organized mentorship programs, volunteer efforts, and neighborhood projects focused on helping the vulnerable and promoting unity. The principles of empathy, integrity, and moral courage were being applied in practical ways, showing that leadership and positive influence could begin at any level, not just in government. The media continued to cover the long-term effects, highlighting stories of change inspired by the exchange. Individuals shared personal experiences of being motivated by the message, whether it was resolving conflicts peacefully, engaging in community service, or reflecting on moral decisions. The story became a reference for the importance of leadership guided by conscience and empathy, demonstrating that a single meaningful moment could inspire widespread, lasting change. As time passed, educational and community programs continued to grow. Schools, universities, and organizations developed curricula and workshops emphasizing ethical leadership, moral reasoning, and the importance of service. Young leaders were encouraged to practice empathy, humility, and forgiveness, preparing them to make decisions that prioritized the well-being of others. The impact of the Traoré-Trump exchange had become institutionalized, influencing systems and structures around the world. In Burkina Faso, citizens expressed pride in the global recognition of their president's ethical leadership. Communities were inspired to uphold values of service, compassion, and integrity in daily life. Local leaders worked to implement policies and programs reflecting these principles, creating a culture of ethical governance and moral responsibility. In the United States, Trump's approach to leadership reflected a greater emphasis on empathy and moral reflection. Advisors and colleagues noticed a shift in priorities, with increased consideration for the human impact of decisions. The story of the summit exchange continued to be cited as a reminder of the importance of values, humility, and reflection in leadership, showing that even the most powerful individuals could learn and grow through meaningful dialogue. The world had begun to recognize that leadership grounded in values could create lasting positive change. The story of Traoré and Trump was no longer just an anecdote, it had become a global lesson in ethical leadership, empathy, and the power of human connection. People everywhere were reminded that even in complex and challenging situations, choosing compassion, integrity, and service could have profound effects. By the end of the year, the exchange had left a lasting legacy. Programs, policies, and initiatives inspired by the principles discussed continued to expand. Leaders and citizens alike were encouraged to reflect on the human impact of their actions, to seek guidance from ethical principles, and to lead with empathy and moral courage. The moment that began in a private lounge during a summit had grown into a symbol of hope, inspiration, and the enduring power of values-driven leadership. The story concluded not as a single event, but as a continuous influence on the world. Traoré and Trump, through their words and actions, had demonstrated that leadership was not only about authority or strategy, but about conscience, empathy, and service. Their example inspired people to act with integrity, to prioritize the well-being of others, and to create communities and societies built on trust, respect, and shared values. And so, the exchange that had once been a quiet, private conversation became a lasting legacy, a reminder that even brief moments of sincerity, courage, and moral reflection could ripple through the world, inspiring change, connection, and hope for generations to come.